Every mother knows the terror of watching her child slip away. Elira holds her newborn against her chest as snow covers them both, her heart breaking with each shallow breath her baby takes. She was a healer's daughter once, with gentle hands, and dreams of raising children in sunlit meadows. Now she's a hunted omega, banished for carrying a child that threatens the royal bloodline. The threadbare cloth around her baby does little against the bitter cold. Her strength fades as winter claims them both, and she closes her eyes beneath a pine tree, ready to surrender. Through the swirling snow comes King Thorne, the iron-crowned alpha whose reputation for ruthlessness keeps enemies at bay. He's alone on patrol, expecting nothing but silence. Instead, he finds a dying woman and quiet infant. Something ancient awakens in his chest that defies every law bred into his warrior's soul. But will a king's mercy survive the weight of his crown? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver pendant had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that. Elira's fingers traced its familiar weight against her throat as she ground dried chamomile in the wooden bowl, the morning sun streaming through the cottage windows like liquid gold. The scent of healing herbs filled the air, lavender from the garden, wild mint from the meadow, and the sharp tang of willow bark that could ease any fever. Gentle hands make gentle healing, her mother used to say, watching Elira's careful movements as she prepared tinctures and salves. Those hands had never known violence, never raised in anger or clenched in hatred. They were made for soothing fevered brows and binding wounds, for coaxing new life from the earth and nurturing what grew. The cottage stood at the village's edge, where the cobblestone streets gave way to wildflower meadows and ancient oak groves. People came from miles around seeking Elira's remedies. Mothers with colicky babes, farmers with aching backs, elderly folk whose joints protested the changing weather. She turned no one away, accepting payment in copper coins when they had them, fresh bread and garden vegetables when they didn't. Her life had been simple then, ordered by the rhythms of seasons and the needs of those who sought her help. She rose with the dawn to gather herbs while the dew still clung to their leaves, spent her mornings preparing medicines and her afternoons tending to visitors. Evenings were for reading her mother's journals by candlelight, learning the old remedies passed down through generations of healers. The kingdom of Valdris stretched beyond the village in rolling hills and fertile valleys, ruled by an iron-fisted monarchy that demanded absolute obedience. King Thorne commanded from his stone fortress, a warrior king whose very name sent shivers through enemy armies. They said he had never lost a battle, never shown mercy to those who crossed him. The common folk whispered stories of his ruthlessness, how he'd crushed rebellions before they could take root, how his wolf-like yellow eyes could freeze a man's blood. But Elira's world had been far removed from royal politics and military campaigns. Her concerns were simpler: whether the winter stores of medicine would last until spring, if the pregnant baker's wife would deliver safely when the traveling merchants might bring new supplies of rare herbs from distant lands. The kingdom's laws regarding omegas were harsh but distant concerns to a healer living quietly at civilization's edge. Omegas were to be protected but controlled, their rare fertility regulated by royal decree. Unmated omegas required permission to bear children, and those children were subject to royal scrutiny. It was an old law, rooted in ancient bloodline, politics that seemed irrelevant to a simple village healer, until the night everything changed. Lord Caelan had arrived during the harvest moon, his fine clothes and polished boots marking him as nobility despite his claims of being a traveling merchant. He was handsome in the way of courtly men, refined features, silver tongue, eyes that promised secrets and adventure. For a woman who had never ventured beyond her village borders, he represented everything mysterious and exciting about the wider world. He stayed 3 weeks, claiming his horse had thrown a shoe and needed rest. 3 weeks of afternoon conversations over tea, evening walks through moonlit meadows, and gentle touches that awakened feelings Elira had never experienced. He spoke of distant cities and foreign customs, of art and music beyond her simple understanding. He made her feel sophisticated, desired, important. When he left, he took her innocence and left her with child. The pregnancy had been difficult to hide at first, but village life provided natural camouflage. Loose-fitting dresses, claims of gaining weight from her own good cooking, careful positioning when visitors came calling. She'd planned to disappear before the birth became obvious, to find some distant place where she could raise her child. In peace. But Lord Caelan had not been the travelling merchant he claimed. He was Prince Caelan of Meridia, heir to a rival throne, and their union, willing or not, had created a child with claims to 2 kingdoms' bloodlines. When his true identity was discovered, when royal spies traced his movements back to her, Cottage, when the implications of their affair became clear to the court, everything unravelled. The accusations came swift and merciless. She was a spy, they claimed, a conspirator in some elaborate plot to weaken Valdris from within. The timing was too convenient, they said, a rival prince seducing a village omega just as tensions between the kingdoms reached their peak. That she might have been an innocent victim of deception never entered their calculations. King Thorne's justice was absolute. She was stripped of her healer's license, her cottage seized by the crown, her name stricken from all records. Pregnant and defenseless, she was banished from the kingdom, with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's silver pendant. The royal decree forbade any citizen of Valdris from offering her aid or shelter, under penalty of sharing her fate. The bitter irony was not lost on her. The healing hands that had soothed so much suffering were now forbidden from practicing their art. The gentle nature that had made her trusted by an entire community was now branded as treacherous. The simple life she had cherished was destroyed by forces she had never understood or sought to influence. Now, months later, weak from childbirth and exposure, she held the result of that long-ago autumn romance. The baby was beautiful, despite their dire circumstances. Perfect features, tiny fingers that curled around hers with surprising strength, eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond their days. This child, innocent of all the political machinations and royal grudges that had shaped their fate, was the most precious thing in a world that had become cold and hostile. The threadbare cloth wrapped around the infant had once been fine linen, part of a christening gown she had sewn during the hopeful months of early pregnancy. Now it was stained with travel and blood, thin from wear, providing little protection against the mountain cold. But sewn into its hem with careful tiny stitches were symbols her grandmother had taught her, old protection runes that were more superstition than medicine, but all she had left to offer. King Thorne's kingdom spread in all directions from this frozen mountainside, a realm built on order and strength. His laws were harsh but clear, his expectations absolute. He had earned his crown through conquest and maintained it through unwavering resolve. In 32 years of life, he had never wavered from duty, never allowed personal feelings to compromise royal obligations. The wolf-like instincts bred into his alpha bloodline served him well in battle and politics. He could sense weakness, smell fear, command obedience through presence alone. His advisors respected him, his enemies feared him, his people obeyed him. It was everything a king should be, everything his father had trained him to become. But something in the ancient bloodline prophecies spoke of change, of choices that would define not just a reign, but the very nature of power itself. The court. Seers whispered of old magic stirring, of bonds that transcended law and duty, of a time when the strongest ruler would be the one who learned to bend. None of it had seemed relevant to a king whose strength lay in never bending, never yielding, never allowing sentiment to cloud judgment, until this moment, kneeling in the snow beside a dying woman and her child, feeling something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with duty or law or the crown that weighed so heavily on his brow. The cloak that wrapped around them was heavy with the weight of kingship. Thick wool dyed the deep blue of royal blood, embroidered with silver threads that caught what little moonlight filtered through the storm clouds. The golden clasp bore the wolf's head crest of House Valdris, a symbol that had struck fear into enemies for 3 generations. Now it became a cocoon of warmth for the most unlikely refugees. Thorne's hands, scarred from swordwork and hardened by years of warfare, moved with surprising gentleness as he lifted the woman and child from their bed of snow. She was lighter than armor, more fragile than any weapon he had ever wielded. Her dark hair spilled across his arm like silk, matted, with ice but still holding traces of its former beauty. The baby made no sound, wrapped so completely in threadbare cloth that only the smallest face was visible, pale skin with lips tinged blue from cold. Every instinct bred into his royal bloodline screamed warnings. This was madness. Kings did not rescue outcasts in the wilderness. Laws existed for reasons, and he had sworn sacred oaths to uphold them without exception. His father's voice echoed in his memory. A king who shows mercy to enemies shows weakness to allies. A ruler who bends law for sentiment breaks the foundation of order itself. But another voice, older and deeper, whispered different truths. This was not an enemy soldier or a political rival. This was a mother and child dying in the snow, and something in their stillness called to parts of his nature he had spent years suppressing. The protective instincts that made him a fierce defender of his kingdom now extended to these fragile lives in his arms. The trek to shelter became a battle against time and elements. Each step through the deepening snow cost precious energy, and the woman's breathing grew more labored with each passing minute. Her fever burned against his chest, even through the cloak, and he could feel her body's desperate struggle to maintain the warmth necessary for life. The baby remained ominously quiet, too quiet for an infant, even one weakened by cold and hunger. Thorne's military training served him now in unexpected ways. He had learned to navigate by starlight, to find shelter in hostile terrain, to conserve energy during forced marches. But those skills had always been applied to warfare, to campaigns of conquest and defense. Never had they been used to save lives rather than take them. The mountain paths were treacherous in daylight and deadly after dark, but he knew these peaks from childhood hunting expeditions and adult military surveys. There was a cabin hidden among the crags, built decades ago by his grandfather as a retreat from the pressures of rule. It had been forgotten by most of the court, known only to the royal family and a few trusted servants, if anywhere could provide the sanctuary these refugees needed. It would be there. Wind howled through the passes like the voices of ancient spirits, carrying snow that stung exposed skin and made each breath a struggle. The woman stirred occasionally in his arms, murmuring words he couldn't understand, sometimes names, sometimes what sounded like prayers or apologies. Her voice was soft even in delirium, marked by the gentle accent of rural Valdris that spoke of village markets and harvest festivals rather than court intrigue. Doubt crept in as the climb grew steeper. What was he doing? What possible justification could he offer for this abandonment of duty? His advisors would be searching for him by now, worried about their king's unexplained absence during a routine patrol. The court would demand explanations. He couldn't give adherence to laws he was actively breaking, but each time he considered turning back, something in the woman's face or the baby's stillness strengthened his resolve. They were innocents caught in circumstances beyond their control, and he had the power to save them. Surely that counted for something in the cosmic balance that governed kingdoms and kings. The cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a gift from benevolent gods. Stone walls that had weathered decades of mountain storms, a roof that promised shelter, windows dark but unbroken. Thorne's key still fit the heavy wooden door, and the interior smelled of old fires and pine timber rather than decay or abandonment. Someone, Probably the caretaker he paid but rarely thought about had maintained it in his absence. Getting. Elira started while supporting an unconscious woman and infant tested skills he hadn't used since childhood. But muscle memory served where conscious thought might have failed, and soon flames crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with hunting trophies and faded tapestries. The warmth felt like a blessing, a promise that death would not claim these lives tonight. Laying the woman on the cabin's single bed, Thorne saw her clearly for the first time. She was young, perhaps 25 at most, with features that spoke of kindness rather than nobility. Her hands were stained with herb usage, marked by the calluses of honest work rather than the soft perfection of court ladies. Even weakened by ordeal, she possessed a quiet beauty that had nothing to do with cosmetics or fashion. The baby stirred as warmth began to penetrate their makeshift cocoon, making small sounds that were the sweetest music Thorne had ever heard. Alive, they were both alive, and with care and time they might remain so. But the night was far from over, and survival would depend on skills he had never been taught, instincts he had never been allowed to develop. A king's education covered warfare, diplomacy, law, and statecraft. It did not include tending to sick women or caring for infants, yet here he was, committed by choice to preserving these lives that law demanded he ignore. The irony was not lost on him. The most powerful man in the kingdom, helpless before. The simple needs of the most powerless. But as the fire grew stronger and the cabin filled with life-giving warmth, something in Thorne's chest expanded to match it. For the first time in his adult life, he was acting not as a king, but as a man, not from duty, but from something deeper and more fundamental. The sensation was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, sealing them into their small sanctuary. Inside, 3 lives hung in delicate balance: a dying woman, a fragile infant, and a king who was learning that the heaviest crown was no match for the weight of a truly awakened heart. The hearthstone was older than the kingdom itself, carved, with symbols that predated written history. Ancient masons had shaped protective wards into its surface, spirals that spoke of endless cycles, interwoven knots that promised unbreakable bonds, stylized trees whose roots and branches merged in eternal embrace. As firelight played across these weathered patterns, they seemed almost alive, pulsing with the rhythm of some deeper heartbeat. Thorne knelt beside the bed, where the woman lay still as death. Her breathing so shallow it barely stirred the threadbare cloth wrapped around her child. Her skin was pale as winter moonlight, lips tinged with the blue of approaching frost. Blood had dried on her clothes, too much blood for someone her size to lose and survive. Yet somehow she clung to life with a determination that spoke of fierce maternal love. His hands, trained for sword and scepter, fumbled with the delicate work of tending wounds. The cuts were clean but deep, made by thorns and sharp stones during her desperate flight through the wilderness. Each laceration told part of her story: the slice across her palm from grabbing a branch during a fall, the tear in her shoulder, from squeezing through a rocky crevice, the dozen smaller wounds that mapped her journey from civilization to this frozen exile. Water heated slowly in the iron pot suspended over the fire, steam rising like prayers to whatever gods watched over. The desperate. Thorne found clean cloth in the cabin's stores, linen meant for royal comfort, now repurposed for humble mercy. His movements were awkward, but careful, guided by instinct rather than training, as he began the work of cleaning and binding wounds. The baby stirred when unwrapped from the threadbare swaddling, tiny limbs moving with the slow weakness of prolonged cold and hunger. The child was perfectly formed, fingers no bigger than twigs, toes like small pearls, a face that held the generic beauty of new life before individual features emerged. But those eyes, when they opened, seemed to hold depths that spoke of old souls and ancient wisdom. Thorne had never held an infant before, Royal children were tended by wet nurses and governesses, kept at careful distance from their sovereign fathers until they reached the age of formal education. The weight of this small life in his hands was simultaneously nothing and everything, barely 3 pounds of flesh and bone, yet carrying the gravity of mortality itself. The child's breathing was as labored as the mother's, each small chest, movement a struggle against cold and weakness. Thorne wrapped the baby in his own undertunic, the fine wool soft against skin that felt fragile as flower petals. Warmth was the first necessity, then nourishment, if any, could be provided. Finding food suitable for an infant in a hunting cabin presented challenges he had never contemplated. There were preserves and dried meat, hard bread and mountain spring water, but nothing appropriate for a newborn who should still be nursing. The mother's condition made feeding impossible, even if she regained consciousness soon. Memories stirred, not his own, but stories heard in childhood from servants who thought royal children weren't listening. Goat's milk mixed with honey, watered, wine for strength, broths made from whatever meat was available. Folk wisdom passed down through generations of women who had faced such crises with resourcefulness born of necessity. The cabin's stores included honey, thick and golden in clay jars that had survived years of storage. Spring water ran clear, from a source that never froze, channeled through stone pipes his grandfather had commissioned. Mixing them carefully, tasting the result to ensure it wasn't too sweet or too thin, Thorne created a substitute that might sustain life until better. Options appeared. Getting nourishment into an infant too weak to suck properly required patience he had never been forced to develop. A few drops at a time on the tip of his finger, waiting for the tiny mouth to accept each offering, watching for signs that the mixture was helping rather than harming. It was delicate work that demanded the kind of attention usually reserved for negotiations with enemy ambassadors. The woman's fever spiked as the cabin warmed, her body fighting infections that had taken hold during her ordeal. She muttered in delirium, fragments of prayers, names of people he didn't recognize, apologies that seemed to encompass a lifetime of perceived failures. Her voice carried traces of education, despite its rural accent, suggesting a background more complex than simple peasant stock. Cooling cloths applied to burning skin, careful positioning to ease her breathing, constant vigilance for signs of improvement or decline, these became Thorne's world as the night deepened. Outside, wind continued to howl through mountain passes, but inside their small sanctuary, time moved with the slower rhythm of sickroom vigils. The work was humbling in ways that crown and scepter had never managed. Here was power in its purest form, the ability to preserve life, to offer comfort to suffering, to stand between death and innocence. Yet it was power that required no armies or treasuries, no laws or edicts. It demanded only presence, patience, and the willingness to put another's needs before one's own comfort. Hours passed with maddening slowness. The fire needed constant tending, the water required regular changing, the baby's needs came in unpredictable waves. Thorne found himself moving between tasks with growing confidence, his natural organizational skills adapting to domestic rather than military requirements. Dawn was still hours away when the woman's eyes finally opened, dark brown irises that held pain and confusion, but also the spark of returning awareness. She tried to speak, but managed only a whisper, her voice cracked from fever and thirst. Her gaze found the baby in his arms and widened with relief so profound it was painful to witness. Water, she managed, and he lifted a cup to her lips with the same care he had shown the infant. She drank greedily at first, then forced herself to sip slowly when her stomach threatened rebellion. Each swallow seemed to bring a little more life back into her pale features. Her eyes remained fixed on her child, and Thorne carefully placed the infant where she could see and touch. The baby's tiny hand curled around her finger with strength that seemed impossible for such a fragile creature. mother and child reconnected in that moment. A bond that had survived banishment, exposure, and near death. "Who are you?" she whispered, her gaze finally meeting his. There was wariness there, the learned caution of someone who had trusted unwisely before, but also gratitude that ran deeper than words could express. The question hung in the warm air between them, weighted with implications neither could fully grasp. He was the king whose laws had banished her, the ruler whose justice had condemned her to death in the wilderness. But he was also the man who had carried her to safety, who had tended her wounds and fed her child with his own hands. "Someone who couldn't leave you to die," he said finally. The simple truth more complex than any lie. The herbs grew wild on the mountainside despite the harsh conditions, hardy plants that had learned to thrive in thin soil and bitter cold. Elira moved slowly through the morning mist, her steps still unsteady but determined, gathering what nature offered for healing. Mountain sage with its silvery leaves, wild mint that grew in protected hollows, pine needles rich with oils that could ease breathing. Her mysterious rescuer watched from the cabin doorway, ready to catch her if weakness overcame determination. She had refused to give her name, just as he had avoided providing his own. They existed in a strange bubble of mutual anonymity, two people whose lives had intersected at the moment of greatest need. "The willow bark," she called softly, pointing to a tree whose inner bark would reduce fever and pain. "Can you reach the higher branches?" His height made easy work of what would have been impossible for her weakened state. He followed her instructions with the careful attention of a student learning from a master, his hands, clearly accustomed to weapons rather than healing tools, growing more confident with each task. "My mother taught me that plants give their medicine freely to those who ask with respect," Elira said as they worked together, her voice growing stronger with activity and purpose. She said healing was about listening to the body, to the spirit, to what the earth itself could provide. "And your father?" The question came without thought, part of the natural conversation that had developed between them. Her hands stilled among the herbs. "A traveling merchant who promised to return for the harvest festival. That was 26 years ago." The pain in her voice was old and well managed, but still present. "My mother said some men are like seeds on the wind. They scatter without thought of where they land or what they leave behind." Back in the cabin's warmth, she prepared the gathered herbs with movements that spoke of years of practice. Her hands knew their work, despite the tremor of recent trauma, crushing leaves to release their essences, mixing proportions by instinct rather than measurement. The baby lay nearby, wrapped in clean cloth and sleeping peacefully for the first. "A time since their rescue. You know healing," he observed, watching her work with growing respect. "I was trained as a village healer. Before," the word carried weight of loss and regret. "Before I made choices that cost me everything I'd ever known." The silence stretched between them, filled with questions neither was ready to ask or answer. He busied himself maintaining the fire while she prepared a tea from the morning's harvest. Mountain herbs steeped in spring water, creating an aroma that spoke of growing things and renewed hope. "The child's father," he said finally. The words, careful and neutral, "Will he come looking for you?" Her laugh held no humor. "He's already forgotten we exist, I'm sure. Men of his station don't concern themselves with the consequences of their entertainments." The bitterness was fresh enough to cut, but underneath it lay a deeper hurt. The pain of someone who had believed in promises that were never meant to be kept. His station. She looked up from her work, studying his face as if seeing him clearly for the first time. There was intelligence in her dark eyes, perception that went beyond simple village wisdom. You ask questions like someone accustomed to having them answered. Your clothes, your bearing, the way you move through this cabin as if you own it, your nobility, aren't you? The observation was accurate enough to be uncomfortable, despite his efforts to help, despite the gentleness he had shown her, and the child, she recognized the markers of privilege that couldn't be entirely hidden. The education in his speech, the confidence in his movements, the subtle expectation of deference that came with a lifetime of command. "Does it matter?" he asked. "It might. Nobles have obligations, loyalties, duties that simple folk don't understand. What happens when your real life calls you back? When whatever brought you to this mountain ends and you remember who you're supposed to be?" The question cut deeper than intended, striking at fears he hadn't fully acknowledged. This interlude couldn't last forever. Eventually his absence would be noted, search parties would be sent, explanations would be demanded. The sanctuary they had created together was temporary by its very nature. "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty surprising them both. The baby stirred, making small sounds that brought immediate attention from both adults. Elira moved to lift the child with movements that were still careful but growing more natural as her strength returned. The infant settled against her chest with the contentment of a creature finally safe and warm. "What's the baby's name?" he asked, realizing he had been thinking of the child simply as the infant or her baby. "I haven't chosen yet. Names have power. They shape destiny, define purpose, create identity. I wanted to wait until we were safe, until I could see what kind of life might be possible." She looked down at the small face with infinite tenderness. "But maybe it's time. Maybe surviving this long deserves recognition." She was quiet for long minutes, studying the child's features, as if finding answers written there in tiny, perfect lines. When she spoke, her voice held the solemnity of naming ceremonies in village squares. "Lyra," she said softly, "for the constellation that guided travelers home when they were lost in strange places." The name felt right, carrying meanings that went beyond its literal translation. Lyra, a name that spoke of music and guidance, of finding harmony from disparate notes, of navigation through difficult times. It suited this child born from chaos, but sustained by love. "Hello, Lyra," he said, and the baby's eyes seemed to focus on his voice with startling awareness. As afternoon wore toward evening, they settled into routines that felt surprisingly natural. Elira prepared medicines, while he maintained the fire and organized supplies. They took turns holding Lyra, watching for signs of continued improvement, sharing the small victories that marked recovery from near death. The conversation came easier now, flowing around safe subjects like the weather, the beauty of mountain sunsets, memories of better times before current troubles began. They were learning each other's rhythms, the subtle cues that indicated tiredness or worry, the small gestures that offered comfort without presumption. But underneath the growing ease lay persistent tension. Smoke from their fire could be seen for miles on a clear day. Their tracks in the snow would be obvious to any skilled tracker. However isolated this cabin might seem, they were still within the borders of a kingdom where she was banished and he was missed. "They'll come looking eventually," Elira said as darkness settled around their refuge, voicing the concern that haunted both their thoughts. "Yes," he agreed, staring into the fire as if it might offer solutions along with warmth. "The question is whether we'll be ready when they do." The wooden wolf emerged from pine branches with surprising grace, its carved features growing more distinct with each careful cut of his hunting knife. Thorne had never considered himself an artist, but something about the evening hours after. Elira and Lyra had fallen asleep, called for quiet work that engaged his hands, while his mind processed the day's revelations. "She's beautiful," Elira said softly, settling beside him near the hearth. Lyra slept peacefully in her arms, the baby's breathing steady and strong after another day of gradual recovery. The child had begun to gain weight, her skin taking on the healthy pink of proper warmth and nourishment. "It's meant to be a wolf," he replied, holding up the carving for inspection. "Though I'm not certain it resembles any wolf that's ever lived. The intention matters more than perfect resemblance. She'll love it, because you made it for her, not because it wins prizes for artistry." Elira traced the carved lines with gentle fingers, her touch bringing warmth to more than just the wooden surface. My mother used to say that gifts made by hand carry the maker's heart. Store-bought things are just objects, but something crafted with care becomes part of the person who receives it. The wisdom was simple but profound, speaking to truths he had never learned in his royal education. Palace gifts were chosen for their value, their political significance, their ability to impress or influence. Personal meaning rarely entered. The calculation and the idea of creating something with his own hands for no purpose beyond giving joy was entirely foreign. "Tell me about your mother," he said, setting the carving aside to give her his full attention. "She was the strongest person I ever knew, and also the gentlest. She could set a broken bone with hands so careful the patient barely felt pain, then turn around and face down an angry husband who'd been beating his wife." Elira's smile held deep affection tempered by loss. "She taught me that healing wasn't just about medicines and techniques. It was about seeing people's pain and refusing to turn away from it." "She sounds remarkable." "She would have loved this," Elira said, gesturing to encompass their small domestic scene. A man learning to be gentle, a woman learning to be strong, a baby bringing out the best in both of them. She always believed that the right people found each other when they needed it most. The observation carried implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Their connection had grown beyond simple rescuer and rescued, beyond temporary alliance born of necessity. In the quiet evening hours, when Lyra slept peacefully and the outside world seemed distant, they had begun to discover compatibility that went deeper than circumstance. "What was your childhood like?" Elira asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than idle conversation. The question required careful navigation. His real childhood had been shaped by tutors and protocols, by the weight of future kingship pressing down from infancy onward. But there had been moments, stolen hours in the castle gardens, adventures with understanding servants, brief tastes of normal boyhood before duty reclaimed him. "Lonely," he said finally, the truth slipping out despite his caution. "Surrounded by people whose job was to serve me, but with few who knew me as more than a title to be honored. I learned early that friendship and loyalty often came with expectations, that genuine affection was rarer than gold and twice as precious." "Is that why you helped us? Because you recognized something familiar in our situation?" "Maybe, or maybe. I was tired of being the kind of person who could walk away from someone in need." He met her eyes, seeing understanding there that went beyond words. "What about you? What made you choose healing as your life's work?" "I didn't choose it as much as it chose me. When I was 7, our neighbor's son fell from a tree and broke his leg badly. The regular healers said it couldn't be set properly, that he would limp forever, but my mother spent 3 days working with the bone, adjusting and readjusting until it aligned perfectly. When he walked normally again, I knew I wanted to learn how to fix things that were broken. And now I wonder if some things break too completely to be mended." The sadness in her voice spoke of more than physical injuries. "My reputation, my place in the world, my ability to trust. I'm not sure healing knowledge extends to wounds of the heart and spirit." The vulnerability in her admission created space for his own honesty. Perhaps healing isn't always about returning to what was before. Sometimes it's about becoming something different, something that incorporates the scars, but isn't defined by them. Wisdom from someone who's never needed healing? Wisdom from someone who's beginning to realize he's been broken for years without recognizing it. The admission surprised him with its truth. Living with duty as the only guide, with law as the only moral framework, with power as the only measurement of worth. Maybe that's its own kind of damage. They sat in comfortable silence, watching firelight play across stone walls, while Lyra's soft breathing provided gentle counterpoint to the wind outside. The evening ritual of checking her condition had become second nature, feeling for fever, observing her color, noting whether she seemed alert and responsive when awake. "She's getting stronger," Elira said with satisfaction. Another week of good food and warmth, and she'll be as healthy as any baby could wish to be. And you? How much longer before you're fully recovered? My body is healing well. The cuts are closing cleanly. My strength returns a little each day. But the other wounds, she paused, choosing words carefully. Trust doesn't mend as easily as flesh. The ability to believe in people's goodness, to open yourself to connection without fear of betrayal, those injuries take longer to heal. Yet you trust me. The observation carried hope and question in equal measure. I don't know if trust is the right word. Maybe recognition is more accurate. I see something in you that resonates with something in me. Two people who've been shaped by circumstances beyond their control, trying to find meaning in choices they can still make. The conversation was interrupted by movement outside, not wind this time, but the deliberate sound of footsteps in snow. Both adults froze, listening intently as the sounds grew closer to the cabin. Someone was approaching, and at this isolated location, visitors could only mean trouble. Thorne moved swiftly but quietly to the window, peering through gaps in the shutters at the moonlit landscape beyond. What he saw made his blood run cold. A single figure moving with the practiced stealth of a trained scout, testing the ground around their refuge, looking for signs of habitation. One person, he whispered to Elira, who had gathered Lyra protectively against her chest. But where there's one scout, there are usually others following. The figure circled the cabin with professional thoroughness, noting the smoke from their chimney, the tracks in the snow, the subtle signs that indicated recent occupation. This wasn't a casual traveler who had stumbled upon their sanctuary. This was someone specifically searching for evidence of their presence. "Royal Guard?" Elira asked, her voice barely audible. "Possibly, or mercenary. The movement patterns are military, but I can't make out uniform details in this light." Thorne's hand rested on his sword hilt, ready for violence but hoping it wouldn't be necessary. The scout completed his circuit and melted back into the forest shadows with the same silent efficiency he had demonstrated throughout his reconnaissance. But his departure didn't bring relief. It brought the certainty that others would follow, that their location had been discovered, that the fragile peace they had built was about to be shattered. "How long do we have?" Elira asked, already beginning to gather their essential belongings with the swift efficiency of someone who had learned to flee at a moment's notice. "Until dawn, maybe less. Scouts report back before launching full operations, but if they're professional soldiers rather than bounty hunters, they'll move quickly once they confirm our location." Thorne's military experience served them now, allowing him to anticipate enemy tactics even as he prepared to flee rather than fight. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was using skills learned in service to his kingdom to escape that same kingdom's justice. But as he watched Elira tend to their daughter with gentle competence, he knew the choice had been worth any personal cost. "Where can we go?" she asked, bundling Lyra in warm layers while keeping her movements quiet and controlled. "There's a network of caves deeper in the mountains, places even my best trackers would have difficulty following. It means traveling through dangerous terrain in winter conditions, but it's better than being captured." Outside, the wind had picked up, howling through the mountain passes with renewed fury. What had seemed like unfortunate weather now felt like a gift. The storm would cover their tracks, muffle sounds of their escape, and make pursuit significantly more difficult. They gathered their few possessions with the efficiency born of necessity, taking only what they could carry while moving quickly through treacherous terrain. The carved wolf went into Thorne's pack alongside medical supplies and emergency food. Elira's herb collection was consolidated to the most essential remedies, everything else abandoned to save weight and space. As they prepared to leave their sanctuary, both adults felt the weight of ending another brief period of peace. But they also felt the strength that came from facing uncertainty together, from choosing love over safety, from protecting what mattered most, even when the cost seemed impossibly high. The baby slept peacefully through their preparations, trusting in the adults who had become her world. That trust was perhaps the most precious thing they carried as they stepped once again into an uncertain night, seeking sanctuary in a world that seemed determined to deny them peace. The letter had been sewn into the lining of her traveling cloak, with stitches so small they were nearly invisible, a woman's careful work designed to hide precious things from prying eyes. Elira's fingers found it while mending a tear by firelight, the crackle of parchment beneath fabric as surprising as finding buried treasure. "What is it?" Thorne asked, noting the sudden stillness in her movements. She worked the stitches carefully, not wanting to damage whatever lay hidden. The thread was silk, expensive and strong, suggesting this concealment had been planned rather than hastily done. When the parchment finally came free, it was folded small and sealed with wax that bore an unfamiliar crest. "I don't remember putting this here," she said, studying the seal with growing confusion. "This isn't my handwriting on the outside, and I've never seen this symbol before." The crest showed a crowned eagle perched above a crescent moon, elegant, official, and definitely foreign. Thorne recognized the artistic style, if not the specific heraldry. This was courtly work, the kind of formal seal used for documents of significant importance. Elira broke the wax carefully, unfolding parchment that proved to be of excellent quality, not the rough paper of common correspondence, but the smooth surface reserved for official communications. The writing was in a masculine hand, flowing but authoritative, dated several months before Lyra's birth. "My dearest Elira," she read aloud, her voice growing tight with emotion. "By the time you read this, circumstances will have forced revelations I hope to avoid. What began as simple attraction has become something far more complex, with implications that reach beyond our personal feelings into matters of state and succession." She paused, looking up at Thorne with eyes that held growing apprehension. "This is Kaelin's writing, but he never gave me any letter. How did it come to be sewn into my cloak?" "Continue reading," he said quietly, though something cold was settling in his stomach. The man you knew as a traveling merchant was indeed a fiction, though the feelings I developed for you were entirely genuine. I am Prince Kaelin of Meridia, heir to a throne that has been at odds with Valdris for longer than either of us has lived. What should have been a brief diplomatic mission became something entirely different when I met you." The words hung in the air like accusations. Elira's hands trembled slightly as she continued reading, her voice growing smaller with each revelation. "Our child, should there be one, will carry bloodlines that could reshape the political landscape of both kingdoms. This is not the romantic destiny I would have chosen, but it is the reality we must face. By the time you discover this letter, forces will already be in motion that neither of us can control." "There's more," she whispered, turning the parchment over. "Your mother's pendant contains more than sentimental value. The herbs preserved within it are from the sacred grove of Meridia, plants that grow nowhere else and possess properties our healers consider almost magical. She was not the simple village woman she appeared to be, and your heritage carries significance you have never been told." Thorne watched Elira's face transform as the implications sank in. Everything she had believed about her identity, her family, her place in the world was being rewritten by words from a man who had already betrayed her once. "The pendant has been examined by enemies of both our kingdoms. They understand its significance even if you do not. Our child will be hunted not just for royal blood, but for the ancient powers that combination might awaken. I have tried to arrange protection, but political realities may make that impossible." "Protection," Elira said bitterly. "He arranged for me to be banished and hunted. Some protection. Keep reading. If circumstances force you to flee, there is a cabin in the northern mountains where you might find temporary sanctuary. The man who owns it is not what he appears to be, but his honor runs deeper than his obligations. Trust him if you must, but remember that kings and princes serve their crowns before their hearts. The final words seemed to leap off the page with prophetic accuracy. Elira looked up at Thorne with new understanding. Pieces of a puzzle, finally. "Clicking into place. You're not just nobility, are you?" she said quietly. "The way the servants maintain this place in your absence, the quality of everything here, the fact that you knew exactly where to find sanctuary in a crisis. You're the king. You're King Thorne." There was no point in denial. The truth had been inevitable from the moment she began to see him clearly. Yes, the same King Thorne who signed my banishment order, who declared me an enemy of the state, and forbade any citizen from offering aid. Her voice remained steady, but he could see the walls going up behind her eyes, the trust they had built crumbling under the weight of royal reality. "The same king who carried you out of a snowstorm and has spent days learning to care for your—" "A child," he replied. "Titles don't change what happened between us, what we've built together, don't they?" She stood carefully, still holding the letter, creating physical distance that reflected emotional withdrawal. Kaelin's letter warns that kings serve their crowns before their hearts. How do I know this isn't some elaborate game, some political maneuver I'm too simple to understand? The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely unreasonable. Royal actions were rarely straightforward, and she had already been deceived once by someone claiming affection while harboring hidden motives. "Because," he said, rising to face her, "if this were political theatre, I would have managed it far more efficiently. I wouldn't have spent days learning to change swaddling cloths and mix infant feeding solutions. I wouldn't have carved wooden toys or listened to stories about your mother's wisdom. Wouldn't you? If the goal required gaining my trust, winning my cooperation, wouldn't a shrewd king do exactly those things?" The conversation was interrupted by renewed sounds outside. Multiple sets of footsteps this time, moving with the careful coordination of trained soldiers. Torchlight flickered through the shutters, and voices carried on the wind, too distant to understand, but clearly human and purposeful. "They've found us," Thorne said, moving quickly to douse the fire and gather their few possessions. "We need to leave now, through the back way I scouted yesterday." But Elira remained still, clutching the letter and studying his face in the dying firelight. "How do I know you're not leading me directly to them? How do I know this whole rescue wasn't planned from the beginning?" Outside, the voices grew closer, and among them he recognized the measured tones of Captain Morris, his most trusted military advisor. The search party wasn't random. They had tracked him specifically, which meant his absence had been noted and investigated. Time was running out for explanations or trust-building. "Because," he said, scooping up Lyra's supplies, while keeping his voice calm despite the urgency, "if I wanted to betray you, I would simply open that door and call them in. The fact that I'm preparing to run should tell you something about where my loyalties actually lie." The logic was sound, but Elira's eyes still held doubt, born of too much deception and disappointment. She tucked the letter into her clothes and lifted Lyra, but her movements carried resignation rather than hope. "One more betrayal won't break me," she said quietly. "I'm already as broken as I can be." "Then trust me not to prove you right," he replied, leading her toward the cabin's rear exit and the mountain paths that might yet offer escape. The ring had been hidden so carefully that discovery came only by accident, a loose thread in Lyra's swaddling that caught on Elira's finger as she changed the baby's wrappings. Beneath the threadbare outer cloth lay another layer, silk so fine it was almost transparent, and sewn into its hem was a small, hard object that had been carefully padded to avoid discomfort. "What is this?" Elira whispered, working the object. Free with careful fingers, while Lyra lay quiet on the cabin's table, seeming to sense the importance of the moment. The ring that emerged was clearly ancient, its gold dulled by age but still bearing intricate engravings that spoke of master craftsmanship. The central stone was a deep blue sapphire surrounded by smaller diamonds, arranged in a pattern that resembled stars around a moon. But it was the engravings on the band that made Thorne's breath catch in recognition. "That's the royal seal of Meridia," he said, his voice tight with implications he was only beginning to grasp. Not just any royal seal. That's the heir's signet, the ring that passes from crown prince to crown prince for coronation ceremonies. Elira turned the ring over in her palm, noting its weight and the way light caught the precious stones, even in their dim cabin. Kaelin put this here. Why would he give away something so valuable, so important? He didn't give it away, Thorne said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn like a terrible sunrise. He placed it with his child. This ring doesn't just prove Kaelin's identity, it establishes Lyra's legitimacy as his heir. The words hung between them with the weight of kingdoms. Elira looked down at her daughter, this small person she had thought of simply as her beloved child, and saw instead a figure around whom wars might be fought and treaties negotiated. You're saying she's a princess, not just any princess, but the acknowledged heir to the throne of Meridia. That ring has been blessed by their priests, recognized by their nobles, accepted by their people as the symbol of legitimate succession. Thorne's military mind was already calculating implications, seeing the chessboard that had just expanded beyond anything they had imagined. Kaelin didn't just seduce a village healer and abandon her. He married you in the eyes of Meridian, or by placing his heir's ring with your child. Married? The word came out strangled, impossible to believe. In Meridia, royal marriages can be contracted by proxy, especially in times of political necessity. The ring serves as both wedding band and coronation symbol. By placing it with Lyra, Kaelin was declaring you his consort, and her his legitimate heir, even if the actual ceremonies couldn't be performed. Elira sank onto the cabin's single chair, overwhelmed by revelations that transformed everything about her situation. But why? Why would he do something so significant in secret? Why? Not tell me, prepare me, explain what was happening? Because, Thorne said grimly, he was probably trying to protect you from exactly what happened. The moment this ring's location became known, every kingdom in the region would have interests in controlling it. Valdris couldn't allow a potential Meridian heir to exist within our borders. Other nations would see Lyra as either a useful tool or a dangerous threat. The baby stirred on her makeshift changing table, tiny hands moving with the random gestures of infancy, but looking at her. Now, knowing what that small life represented, both adults felt the weight of destiny pressing down like mountain snow. The hunt wasn't just about an illegitimate child who might cause scandal, Elira said, understanding beginning to replace confusion. It was about preventing Meridia from having a legitimate heir who might someday unite the kingdoms through marriage or conquest. Exactly. And now that we know what we're dealing with, the danger has multiplied exponentially. It's not just Valdris forces we need to worry about. Every major power will want to either control Lyra or eliminate the threat she represents. As if summoned by their conversation, sounds of pursuit grew closer outside. But these weren't the measured steps of a single search party. Multiple groups were converging on their location, and the voices carried accents from different regions. Word had spread, and interested parties were closing in from all directions. "The letter in your cloak," Thorne said suddenly. "Show it to me again." Elira pulled out Kaelin's message, and Thorne examined it with new understanding. "Look at the wax seal more carefully. That's not just Meridian royal arms. There are additional markings, tiny symbols pressed into the edges." She held the broken wax pieces up to the firelight, noting details that had escaped previous examination. These looked like territory markers, boundary stones, property claims. His face was grim as implications became clear. This isn't just a letter explaining your situation. It's a legal document establishing territorial claims through royal marriage. Kaelin was trying to create a legitimate basis for Meridian expansion into Valdris lands. Through me, through our daughter, through both of you. If you were recognized as his legal consort and Lyra as his heir, any lands you might claim or Inherit would become meridian territory by right of royal marriage. Your mother's heritage, whatever that might prove to be, could become the foundation for territorial expansion. The political chess game was becoming clearer, and Elira found herself in the center of moves she had never understood were being made. So I was never just a woman, seduced and abandoned. I was a strategic asset acquired for future use. Perhaps. Or perhaps Kaelin's feelings were genuine, and he was trying to protect those feelings within the constraints of royal duty. The letter suggests real affection alongside political calculation. Outside, the sounds of encirclement grew more organized. Orders were being shouted in multiple languages, and the flicker of torches suggested substantial forces had gathered. Their mountain sanctuary was about to become a battleground. "What do we do?" Elira asked, lifting Lyra and holding her close. The baby seemed heavier now, weighted with the significance of her bloodline and the destiny it implied. "We run," Thorne said simply, "as far and as fast as we can. Because the moment any of these forces captures you and that ring, Lyra becomes a pawn in games that could reshape the entire region. And you? What happens to the King of Valdris when he's discovered helping enemy royalty escape justice?" The question cut to the heart of his impossible position. By helping them, he was arguably committing treason against his own kingdom. By abandoning them, he would be condemning an innocent child to death or a life of political manipulation. "I suppose," he said, checking his weapons and preparing for what might be their final escape, "I discover whether being a king matters more than being a man." The first shouts came from directly outside the cabin, multiple voices coordinating. An assault. Whatever happened next would determine not just their personal fates, but the political future of multiple kingdoms. Lyra slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that she had just become one of the most important and most endangered people in the known world. The war horn felt cold in Thorne's hands, its bronze surface etched with battle honors from campaigns that seemed like ancient history now. This simple instrument had once summoned armies, coordinated cavalry charges, and signaled victories that expanded his kingdom's borders. Now it represented an impossible choice: call for help, and reveal their location to every enemy within miles, or face the approaching forces with nothing but their own resources. "How many are out there?" Elira whispered, adjusting Lyra's wrappings to muffle any sounds the baby might make. Her movements were economical, practiced, the motions of someone who had learned to pack for flight with heartbreaking efficiency. Through gaps in the shutters, Thorne counted torches and estimated numbers based on the coordination of voices. At least 3 separate groups, maybe 40 soldiers total. Valdris forces from the east, but also mercenaries from the west, and what sounds like a meridian accent from the north. All hunting for us? All hunting for her. His gaze fell on Lyra, this small person whose very existence had become a flashpoint for international conflict. The heir's ring changes everything. She's not just a bastard child anymore. She's a legitimate claim to a throne, a living treaty, a potential catalyst for war or peace. The medicine bag Elira was preparing held herbs selected for very different purposes than healing. Mountain mushrooms that could induce sleep when powdered and thrown, roots that created thick smoke when burned, leaves that caused temporary blindness if rubbed in the eyes. Her gentle healer's knowledge had transformed into survival skills with desperate efficiency. "The path through Devil's Canyon," she said, checking their supplies one final time. "It's treacherous in daylight and nearly impossible at night, but it leads to neutral territory. If we can reach the borderlands, if we can survive the next hour," Thorne interrupted, noting how the voices outside were growing more organized, more confident. "They're not planning to take prisoners, are they?" The question didn't require an answer. Both adults understood that Lyra's value lay in control, not in her continued existence as an independent person. A dead heir couldn't make territorial claims or form political alliances. A living heir could be raised to serve whoever controlled her upbringing. Thorne's tactical mind catalogued their advantages and disadvantages with military precision. They knew the terrain better than their pursuers. They were motivated by love rather than duty, and they had the element of desperation that could fuel extraordinary effort. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and carrying an infant who couldn't be abandoned or silenced on command. "There's something else," Elira said quietly, pulling a small vial from her medicine bag. "This is concentrated extract from the herbs. In my mother's pendant, Kaelin's letter suggested they had special properties, but I never understood what he meant. The liquid inside the vial seemed to catch firelight strangely, swirling with colors that shouldn't have been possible in plant extract." When Elira unstoppered it briefly, the scent was unlike anything Thorne had experienced. Not quite flower, not quite spice, but something that seemed to speak directly to parts of his brain usually dormant. "What does it do?" "I don't know exactly. Mother always said it was for the most desperate circumstances, when ordinary healing wasn't enough. She made me promise to save it for life or death situations." Elira's voice carried uncertainty and hope in equal measure. Maybe it's time to discover what desperate circumstances she had in mind. A shout from outside indicated the search parties had found their tracks, the clear trail in snow that led directly to the cabin's door. Time for preparation was over. The next few minutes would determine whether their strange family survived to see another dawn. Thorne made the decision that had been building since the first sounds of pursuit reached his ears. The horn went into his pack rather than to his lips. Calling for help would bring more enemies than allies, and their only hope lay in escape rather than confrontation. "The back window leads to the cliff path," he said, shouldering their gathered supplies. "It's a 20-foot drop to the ledge, but there are handholds carved into the rock. Can you manage it while carrying Lyra? Can you manage it while carrying me if I can't?" The question was practical rather than romantic, acknowledging the reality that all 3 lives depended on successful coordination, if necessary. The promise was simple but absolute. Whatever happened, he would not let them fall. The babies stirred as they prepared to leave their sanctuary, tiny eyes opening to regard the adults with that unsettling awareness that seemed too mature for her age. For a moment, Lyra's gaze seemed to fix on the approaching danger with understanding that went beyond infant comprehension. "She knows," Elira whispered, noting the same phenomenon. "Somehow, she understands what's happening." The first impacts against the cabin door interrupted any further speculation. Their pursuers had finished surrounding the building and were preparing for assault. Heavy boots kicked at hinges designed to resist mountain weather, but not military force. "Now," Thorne said, lifting the rear window's iron latch. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of snow and pine, along with the distant voices of men who hunted them. The drop to the cliff path looked treacherous in moonlight, but it represented their only chance at continued freedom. Elira went first, clutching Lyra against her chest while feeling for footholds carved by some long-ago mountain climber. The baby remained remarkably quiet, as if understanding that silence meant survival. Thorne followed, pulling the window closed behind them and praying that their absence wouldn't be discovered immediately. The path was worse than memory suggested, narrow, icy, with sections where weathering had eroded the original construction. But it led away from the cabin, away from the voices and torches, toward the deep wilderness where large groups couldn't follow easily. Behind them, wood splintered as the cabin door gave way. Shouts of anger and frustration indicated empty rooms. Cold hearth, prey that had escaped the trap. Within minutes, the pursuit would reorganize and expand, tracking them through terrain that offered few hiding places. "The canyon's still 5 miles. Elira said, her voice steady despite the exertion of carrying Lyra along treacherous paths. "Can we stay ahead of them that long?" "We have to." Thorne's reply carried grim determination rather than false optimism, because the alternative is unthinkable. Above and behind them, Torches began spreading across the mountainside like scattered stars, each light representing soldiers who would show no mercy if they succeeded in their hunt. The race for neutral territory had begun, and the stakes couldn't possibly be higher. A kingdom's future balanced on the shoulders of a woman carrying her daughter through frozen wilderness, guided by a king who had chosen love over crown. The knife had never been meant for violence. Its silver blade was designed for gathering herbs, its curved edge perfect for harvesting delicate roots without damage. But as soldiers poured through the mountain pass like water through a broken dam, Elira gripped her mother's ceremonial tool. With the fierce determination of someone who had discovered that gentle hands could fight when protecting what mattered most. "Stay behind the rocks," Thorne commanded, his sword singing as it cleared its sheath. The weapon had been forged for a king, balanced perfectly, sharp enough to split silk, heavy enough to cleave armor. In his hands it became an extension of will made manifest in steel. No matter what happens, keep Lyra safe. The first wave struck with the coordination of professional soldiers. Valdris forces came from the east, their uniforms familiar, but their faces hard with duty that allowed no room for mercy. These men had served him faithfully for years, but now they saw only a traitor who had abandoned his kingdom for enemy interests. Captain Morris led the charge, his weathered face a mask of disappointed loyalty. "My lord," he called across the shrinking distance, "surrender now and we can resolve this with minimal bloodshed. You're still our king. This madness can be undone." "Some choices can't be unmade," Thorne replied, settling into the combat stance that had won him a dozen battles. "And some loyalties run deeper than crowns." Steel met steel with the harsh music of professional violence. Morris was skilled, trained by the same masters who had shaped Thorne's technique, but a lifetime of command had given the king advantages that went beyond pure skill. He fought with the desperate strength of someone protecting his heart's choice, while Morris battled with the conflicted duty of a man attacking his sworn lord. From the western approach, mercenaries closed in with weapons drawn and gold promised for success. These men owed no loyalty to anyone but their purses, making them simultaneously more dangerous and more predictable. They fought without hesitation, but also without the coordination that came from fighting for shared cause. Elira watched the battle unfold, while shielding Lyra behind a granite outcropping, her healer's mind cataloguing injuries, even as her mother's heart screamed at the violence being done on her behalf. But when one mercenary broke through Thorne's defensive line and headed directly toward their hiding place, instincts older than civilization took control. The silver blade caught moonlight as she moved, its familiar weight transformed by necessity into something deadly. The mercenary saw a woman with a baby and expected easy capture. Instead, he met a mother defending her child, and the difference proved fatal. Her strike was precise, guided by anatomical knowledge that made it far more effective than random violence could ever be. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the dying man, her healer's nature requiring acknowledgement of the life she had taken. But her hands remained steady as she wiped blood from the ceremonial blade, and her resolve hardened rather than weakened. Thorne's swordwork had created space around their position, but more enemies pressed forward from multiple directions. The Meridian forces arrived from the north, with tactics that spoke of royal military training, disciplined formations, coordinated attacks, the kind of strategic thinking that had made their kingdom a regional power. "The child," their leader called in accented but clear speech. "Give us the child and the mother, and the false king can walk away alive." "Counteroffer," Thorne replied between parries, his blade weaving patterns that kept 3 attackers at obey simultaneously. "Leave now, and I'll let some of you live to report your failure." The battle's rhythm shifted as Lyra began to manifest abilities that no one had expected. The baby's cries took on harmonics that seemed to resonate in the mountain stone itself, creating vibrations that made footing uncertain for anyone not accustomed to the frequency. Her small fists glowed with light that had nothing to do with reflected moonlight, and that radiance seemed to strengthen Thorne's sword arm while making his opponents hesitant and clumsy. "What is she doing?" Morris called out, his attack faltering. A strange energy swirled around the infant. "Growing into her birthright," Elira replied, understanding beginning to dawn as she watched her daughter's powers emerge under extreme stress. The royal blood of two kingdoms wasn't the only inheritance Kaelin had passed to his child. There were older magics at work, bloodline gifts that had been dormant until crisis awakened them. The combination of Thorne's warrior skills, Elira's protective fury, and Lyra's emerging abilities created a defensive triangle that none of their enemies had anticipated. But numbers still mattered, and fresh soldiers continued arriving as word spread of the fugitives' location. "We can't hold this position much longer," Thorne said during a brief lull in the assault. Blood ran down his sword arm from a cut that hadn't quite been avoided, and exhaustion was beginning to slow his reflexes. "If they coordinate a full assault from all sides—" His words were cut off by new arrivals, a fourth group that emerged from terrain so difficult that their approach had gone unnoticed until they were already in position. But these newcomers didn't wear the uniform of any known army, and their weapons were crafted with techniques that seemed ancient rather than modern. "Interesting," their leader said, studying the battlefield with eyes that held depths of knowledge and experience. "A king who fights for love rather than law, a healer who kills to protect life, and a child whose bloodline carries more power than anyone suspected. Perhaps it's time to balance the odds." The iron crown hit the stone ground with finality that echoed through the mountain pass like a bell tolling the end of an age. Thorne's hands were free now, unburdened by the weight of kingship, able to fight with the pure desperation of a man protecting his chosen family rather than the calculated duty of a ruler defending abstract principles. "You would abandon your kingdom for them?" Captain Morris asked, his sword wavering as he stared at the discarded symbol of everything they had both sworn to serve. "I would choose love over law, yes," Thorne replied, his blade moving with fluid grace that seemed enhanced by his decision. "Some things matter more than crowns, Morris. Some bonds run deeper than oaths." The mysterious newcomers proved to be allies rather than another threat. Mountain folk whose loyalty ran to older laws than royal decrees, people who recognized the significance of bloodlines that went back to the kingdom's founding. Their leader was an elderly woman whose eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had survived by understanding the deeper currents of power. "The child carries more than royal blood," she called to the assembled armies, her voice somehow carrying clearly. "Despite the chaos of battle, she is heir to magics that your kingdoms have forgotten, bloodlines that predate your political boundaries. Would you destroy such a legacy for temporary advantage?" Elira felt the truth of those words resonate in her bones, understanding finally, dawning about her mother's pendant, her grandmother's knowledge, the heritage she had never fully comprehended. The healing gifts weren't just trained skills. They were manifestations of older powers, abilities that connected her bloodline to the very foundations of the land itself. Lyra's powers were growing stronger with each moment of crisis, her infant mind somehow instinctively understanding how to channel energies that seasoned mages spent decades learning to control. Light emanated from her small form, not harsh or blinding, but warm and reassuring, pushing back the darkness of conflict with radiance that spoke of hope rather than destruction. The mountain folk joined the battle with weapons that seemed carved from the stone itself, their techniques flowing like water while striking with the implacable force of avalanches. They fought not for gold or political advantage, but for the preservation of something precious and irreplaceable, the continuation of bloodlines that carried the memory of older, wiser times. But the greatest shift came when Elira finally opened her mother's vial, releasing concentrated essence that had been preserved for exactly this moment of desperate need. The liquid touched the mountain air and transformed into mist that spread across the battlefield, carrying with it the scent of growing things and the promise of renewal. Where the mist touched wounded soldiers, injuries began to heal themselves. Where it encountered weapons raised in anger, steel became too heavy to lift. Where it met eyes filled with hatred, expressions softened as combatants remembered that they were all human beings, with families and dreams beyond the immediate conflict. "What is this sorcery?" the Meridian leader demanded, but his voice lacked the edge of earlier aggression. "Not sorcery," Elira replied, understanding flooding through her as the ancient knowledge awakened fully. "Healing. The kind of deep healing that mends not just bodies, but hearts and minds. The gift my bloodline has carried for centuries, waiting for the moment when it would be needed most." Thorne's swordwork had transcended mere technique, becoming an expression of protective love so pure that even his enemies hesitated to strike. This was not the calculated violence of kingship, but the desperate beauty of someone fighting for the right to exist peacefully with those he cherished most. The tide of battle turned not through superior force, but through the gradual recognition that they were all participating in something larger than political conflict. Lyra's light, Elira's healing mist, and Thorne's transformed purpose combined to create a space where violence became difficult to sustain. Captain Morris was the first to lower his weapon, his face reflecting the internal struggle between duty and dawning understanding. "My lord," he said quietly, "what you've found here, perhaps it's worth more than any kingdom." The mercenaries, motivated only by payment, began to withdraw as the mystical energies made their weapons useless and their violent intentions increasingly difficult to maintain. Gold couldn't buy victory over powers that worked by healing rather than harming. Even the Meridian forces found their aggression dissolving as the mist reached them, their mission to capture the air transformed by recognition that some legacies were too precious to be claimed by force. Their leader studied Lyra with new respect, seeing not a political asset but a living embodiment of hope for troubled times. "The child will be safer here than in any palace," the elderly mountain woman observed, her words carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades watching the rise and fall of political arrangements. Love and ancient magic provide better protection than armies and treaties. As dawn broke over the mountain pass, the battlefield had been transformed into something resembling a peace conference. Weapons were sheathed, positions abandoned, and the various factions found themselves talking rather than fighting. The combination of Lyra's emerging powers, Elira's healing gift, and Thorne's sacrifice of crown for conscience had created possibilities that none of them had imagined when the pursuit began. "So, what happens now?" Morris asked, speaking for many who had come as enemies but were leaving as something different. Thorne looked at Elira and Lyra, his chosen family more precious than any treasure his kingdom had ever held. The crown lay forgotten on the cold stone, no longer the symbol of his identity, but merely one choice among many he had the power to make. "Now," he said with deep satisfaction, "we discover what life looks like when it's built on love instead of law, on choice instead of obligation. Now we find out who we can become when we're free to be ourselves." The sun rose over a world transformed, where a king had chosen to be a man, a healer had learned to fight, and an infant had revealed powers that could reshape the understanding of what was possible when love became the governing principle of existence. The pendant had been crafted from elements that shouldn't have harmonized, but somehow did. Silver from Elira's healing stones, gold from the crown Thorne had abandoned, and at its center one of Lyra's first baby teeth, preserved in crystal that caught light like captured starshine. It hung around Elira's neck as she worked in the garden, her hands once again dedicated to coaxing life from mountain soil. 6 months had passed since the battle that changed everything, and the high meadow they now called home had transformed. Under their combined efforts, Thorne's warrior strength had cleared fields and built stone walls, while Elira's knowledge had determined what would grow in the harsh mountain climate. Their small house stood where the ancient cabin had once provided. Temporary shelter, expanded and improved, but retaining the same protective spirit. "She's walking!" Thorne called from where he sat carving another wooden toy, this one a horse, to join the growing collection of animals that populated Lyra's play area. The baby had taken her first independent steps that morning, moving between her parents with the determined concentration that characterized everything she did. Lyra had grown into a beautiful child whose eyes held depths that seemed impossible for someone barely a year old. Her powers had stabilized into a gentle ability to encourage healing and growth. Flowers bloomed brighter in her presence, injured animals sought her out for comfort, and the very air around her seemed to carry peace. She was royal by blood, but raised by love, and the combination was creating someone remarkable. The mountain community had embraced their unusual family, with the acceptance that came from people who valued character over titles. Thorne was known simply as a skilled craftsman and protector, his royal past mentioned only when necessary for legal purposes. Elira had returned to healing work, her reputation spreading through the region as someone whose gentle touch could mend both body and spirit. Their home had become an informal sanctuary for others seeking refuge from the political complications of the lowlands. Former soldiers who had grown weary of endless conflicts, families displaced by border disputes, young people seeking alternatives to lives of predetermined obligation, all found welcome in the community that had grown around their example. "The messenger from Valdris came again today," Elira mentioned, settling beside Thorne to watch their daughter play. "Captain Morris sends his respects and reports that the kingdom prospers under the council leadership." Thorne's abdication had created space for a more collaborative approach to governance, with trusted advisors sharing responsibilities that had once fallen solely on royal shoulders. The transition had been surprisingly smooth, suggesting that perhaps concentrated power had never been as necessary as tradition claimed. "Any word from Meridia?" he asked, though his tone suggested the answer mattered less than it once would have. "Prince Kaelin's brother has been crowned, and they've formally recognized Lyra's right to inherit should she choose to claim it when she comes of age. No pressure, no demands, just acknowledgement that the option exists if she wants it." Both kingdoms had learned to respect the choice their little family had made, understanding that some legacies were better preserved through love than through political maneuvering. Lyra would grow up knowing her heritage, but not bound by it, free to choose her own path when the time came for such decisions. The afternoon brought visitors as it often did. Families seeking Elira's healing touch, neighbors sharing news and requesting Thorne's help with construction projects, children drawn to play with the magical baby who made their games more joyful. Their home had become the heart of a community built on mutual support rather than hierarchical obligation. As evening approached, Thorne built up the fire while Elira prepared their simple dinner. Lyra sat between them, babbling in the complex language of early childhood, while her small hands glowed faintly with contentment. The scene was domestic and peaceful, marked by the deep satisfaction that came from lives lived according to chosen values rather than inherited expectations. "And do you ever regret it?" Elira asked the question that sometimes surfaced during quiet moments like these. "Giving up everything you were born to be?" Thorne considered his response while watching firelight play across their daughter's face. "I gave up what others expected me to be in order to become who I actually am. That's not loss, that's liberation." The truth of his words settled around them like a comfortable blanket. They had all become themselves more fully by choosing love over law, connection over convention, authenticity over obligation. The transformation had been costly, but ultimately enriching in ways that material wealth could never match. Outside their windows, the mountain community settled into evening routines. Lights appeared in windows of houses they had helped build, gardens they had helped plan, workshops where former enemies had learned to work side by side. Their choice to prioritize love and healing had created ripples that continued spreading outward, touching lives in ways they might never fully understand. Lyra fell asleep in her father's arms, while her mother sang lullabies that blended traditional melodies with improvised verses about their unusual family story. She would grow up knowing that love had triumphed over politics, that healing was more powerful than harming, that choices made from the heart could reshape entire worlds. The pendant caught firelight as Elira moved, its mixed metals and crystal center reflecting the blended nature of their life together. They were no longer defined by their separate pasts, but by their shared commitment to building something better than what they had inherited. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but full of possibility, grounded in the bedrock certainty that whatever challenges arose, they would face them together. In the distance, mountain peaks stood eternal against star-filled skies, witnesses to countless human struggles and triumphs. But here in their small sanctuary, three people had discovered that the greatest kingdoms were built not from territory conquered, but from hearts opened, not from power exercised, but from love freely given and gratefully received. They had found their way home to each other, and that was victory enough for any lifetime.